It started on a Thursday evening, one of those unremarkable nights where nothing felt urgent or exciting. I was in the kitchen, reheating leftover lasagna, when Hannah walked in with a glass of wine and that look she always wore when she was building up to something. She leaned against the counter, swirling her wine like she was about to critique a mediocre restaurant. "I've been thinking," she said, her tone as light as the Chardonnay in her glass. "What if we tried opening up our relationship?" I froze, the microwave still humming behind me. For a moment, I thought I'd misheard her. "Sorry, what?" I asked, laughing a little, waiting for her to join in the joke. She didn't. Instead, she gave me this half-smile, the kind she used when she thought she was being clever. "I mean, don't you ever feel stuck? Like we've been together so long that maybe we're missing out on something?" I put the lasagna on the counter and leaned back, studying her face for any sign that she wasn't serious. But she was. That was the worst part. How calm she was, like she wasn't about to blow a hole through our marriage. "You're saying you want to sleep with other people?" I asked, my voice deliberately slow, like saying it out loud might make it sound more ridiculous. Hannah shrugged, taking another sip of her wine. "It's not just about that. It's about freedom, excitement. And you could too. It's not like I'm saying it's one-sided." "Generous of you," I said, the sarcasm slipping out before I could stop it. She rolled her eyes, setting her glass down on the counter. "Don't be dramatic, Luke. This isn't about us being broken or anything. It's about keeping things fresh. Fresh. Right. Like our marriage was a loaf of bread about to go stale." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. My brain was racing, trying to process what she just said and why it felt like the floor beneath me had started cracking. She didn't push me, though. She just kissed me on the cheek like it was any other night and went upstairs to take a shower, leaving me standing there with my cold lasagna and 100 questions I didn't know how to ask. 2 nights later, she told me she was going out with some friends from work. Nothing unusual. She'd done it before. But when she came back at 2:30 in the morning, her hair was messy, her lipstick smudged, and her perfume different. Stronger. Heavier. I was on the couch, pretending to watch a rerun of a game I didn't care about. She stumbled through the door, kicking off her heels with a loud clatter, and froze when she saw me. "Didn't expect you to still be up," she said, her tone breezy, like we were strangers making small talk. "Did you have fun?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. She blinked, surprised by the question. "Don't be weird, Luke. I told you, this is fine. You said you were okay with it." I hadn't said that. What I'd said was, I need to think about it. But apparently, in her mind, that was the same thing as a green light. I didn't push it that night. I let her go upstairs, her perfume lingering in the air long after she disappeared. By the next week, she wasn't even pretending. She went out 3 nights in a row, each time wearing outfits that clung a little tighter, showed a little more skin. Her phone never left her hand, and she smiled at it constantly, laughing at texts I wasn't supposed to see. "You should try it too," she said one night as she brushed past me to grab her coat. "Find someone hot. It'll be good for you." I wanted to say something, anything, but the words caught in my throat. Instead, I just nodded, watching her walk out the door and wondering when she'd stopped feeling like my wife and started feeling like a stranger. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. She told me she was going to a yoga class, but she left the house in a skirt so short it barely qualified as clothing and heels that clicked sharply on the hardwood floor. Something in me snapped. I grabbed my keys and followed her. She didn't go to yoga. She drove to a house across town, one I didn't recognize, and parked in the driveway like she belonged there. I watched as she walked up to the door, her steps confident, her head held high. A man opened the door, a guy I vaguely recognized from her office holiday party. Eric, or Ethan, or something like that. He smiled when he saw her, leaning down to kiss her cheek as she stepped inside. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. 2 hours passed, though it felt like no time at all. When she finally came out, she looked happy, relaxed. She didn't even check to see if anyone was watching before she drove off. That night, she slid into bed beside me like nothing had happened. She smelled like sweat and cologne, and not mine. "I had fun today," she whispered, her breath warm against my neck. You should have joined me. I almost laughed. Instead, I just said, maybe next time. She rolled over and fell asleep, leaving me staring at the ceiling, wondering how much longer I could keep pretending I was okay. The next morning, Hannah was back to her usual routine, moving through the kitchen with her coffee like nothing had changed. She hummed a tune I didn't recognize, her phone lighting up with messages every few minutes. I watched her from the table, wondering how she could act so normal when everything felt like it was cracking apart. "Do you want eggs?" she asked, glancing over her shoulder. Her tone was casual, almost cheerful, and it made my stomach turn. "No," I said, pushing my chair back and standing up. She frowned slightly. "Suit yourself." The day passed in a haze. I went to work, sat through meetings, and nodded at things I didn't hear. I couldn't stop replaying the image of her walking into that man's house, the way she looked at him, the way she carried herself, confident, comfortable, like she belonged there. By lunchtime, I decided I needed to do something. Sitting around and letting her rewrite the rules of our marriage wasn't working. So, I texted her, "Dinner tonight?" Her reply came within seconds. "Can't. Going out with the girls." Rain check? Girls. Sure. After work, I didn't go home. Instead, I drove across town to the same house I'd seen her enter the day before. Her car was there again, parked in the driveway like it was her second home. I sat across the street, my hands gripping the wheel, trying to decide if I was about to do something stupid. It didn't take long for my frustration to win. I got out of the car and walked up to the door. It took a moment, but eventually, the man, Ethan, that was his name, opened the door. His expression shifted the second he saw me, going from surprised to nervous so fast it almost made me laugh. Luke, right?" he said, his voice a little too loud. "Is Hannah here?" I asked, crossing my arms and leaning casually against the doorframe. Ethan froze for a split second, then glanced over his shoulder. "She, just left." "Cool. I'll wait." I stepped past him into the house before he could stop me. The living room was neat, too neat, like he'd spent the last hour cleaning up before Hannah arrived. I heard soft footsteps from the kitchen, and there she was, wearing his shirt and nothing else. Her face went pale the second she saw me. "Look," she said, her voice sharp and breathless. "What the hell are you doing here?" I leaned on the counter, meeting her eyes with a calmness I didn't feel. "I thought we were trying open relationships. Isn't that what you wanted?" Her mouth opened, then shut again. She looked over at Ethan, who was hovering near the doorway like he might need to run at any second. "Relax," I said, smiling slightly. "I'm not mad. I just thought I'd join the fun." "So, who's next for me?" That set her off. She slammed a mug down on the counter, her face flushing red. "Oh, cut the crap, Luke. You've had plenty of time to find someone. Don't stand there acting like some victim." I tilted my head, watching her carefully. "Who said I haven't?" Her expression froze, and for a moment, the room felt completely still. "Who?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I shrugged. "Does it matter? You're obviously having a great time. Isn't that the point?" She glared at me, her fists clenched at her sides. Behind her, Ethan looked like he wanted to disappear. I didn't stay much longer. I left them standing in the kitchen, their perfect little bubble burst, and drove home. That night, Hannah came into our bedroom later than usual. She didn't say anything, just climbed into bed and pressed herself against me, her body warm and familiar in a way that felt like a lie. "I missed you," she whispered, her lips brushing against my neck. I caught her wrist as her hand slid across my chest. "You smell like him." Her breath hitched, and for a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, her voice turned defiant. "You're the one who agreed to this." I let go of her wrist, rolling onto my side to face away from her. "You wanted this, Hannah. Now live with it." She didn't try to touch me again. I lay awake for hours, staring at the shadows on the ceiling and wondering how much longer I could keep pretending this wasn't breaking me apart. The following week, Hannah acted like nothing had happened. She still went out most nights, dressed in outfits that left little to the imagination, her heels clicking confidently on the floor as she left. Each time, she barely spared me a glance. Her phone was always in her hand, lighting up with messages that made her smile in ways she hadn't smiled at me in months. "You should really think about finding someone," she said one evening as she applied lipstick in front of the hallway mirror. "It's not healthy to sit around brooding." "I'll take that under advisement," I said dryly, watching her reflection. Her smile didn't falter, but there was something cold in her eyes, a flicker of satisfaction at the idea that she'd gotten under my skin. She picked up her clutch and left, leaving the house eerily quiet. I didn't follow her this time. I didn't need to. I knew exactly where she was going and who she'd be with. Instead, I started making my own plans. It wasn't hard to find Ashley, Ethan's fiancée. I'd met her briefly at a work event a few months ago, but the memory of her hadn't left me. She was sharp, beautiful, and carried herself with a quiet confidence that Hannah never could have faked. Reaching out to her was easier than I expected. She picked up on the first ring, her voice calm and professional, until I explained why I was calling. There was a long pause, and then she said, "You're kidding, right?" "I wish I was," I said. "I've got proof if you need it." Her tone shifted instantly. "Meet me tomorrow. Bring everything you've got." When we met at a quiet cafe the next afternoon, she was already seated, a coffee in front of her and her phone on the table. She looked more composed than I expected, but her eyes betrayed her, a flicker of hurt breaking through her calm exterior when I handed her the photos. "These were from last week," I said, sliding the prints across the table. "But it's been going on longer than that." Ashley didn't cry. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she let out a short, humorless laugh. "I should have known. Ethan's been distant for months. Guess now I know why." "I'm sorry," I said, and I meant it. She shook her head. "Don't be. This isn't on you. But I'm not going to let them get away with it." I leaned back, a small smile creeping onto my face. "Glad to hear it." We spent the next hour piecing together a plan. She was smarter than I'd anticipated, sharper than Ethan or Hannah ever gave her credit for. By the time we left the cafe, I had the beginnings of something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. That Saturday, we put everything in motion. Hannah thought I was out golfing with friends. Ethan thought Ashley was visiting her sister. Instead, we met at a bar across town, the kind of place where everyone was just a little too dressed up for it to be casual. Ashley played her part perfectly. She leaned in close when she laughed, her hand brushing against my arm just enough to look intimate. She smiled at me like I was the only person in the room, and for a moment, I almost forgot this was all part of the plan. Ethan and Hannah walked in about 20 minutes later. I saw Ethan first, his eyes scanning the bar until they landed on us. His face turned pale, his posture stiffening. Hannah was a few steps behind him, her phone in hand as usual, until she followed his gaze. When she saw us, she froze. "Look," she said, her voice sharp, disbelief dripping from every syllable. Ashley leaned closer, her lips brushing against my ear as she whispered, loud enough for both of them to hear, "I told you we'd get caught." Ethan looked like he wanted to sink into the floor. Hannah, on the other hand, was seething. "What the hell is this?" she demanded, storming toward us. I leaned back in my chair, smiling up at her. "Just taking your advice. You said I should find someone." "You're sleeping with his fiancée," she spat, her voice rising enough to draw attention from the nearby tables. Ashley tilted her head, feigning confusion. "Isn't that what open relationships are for? Sharing?" Ethan grabbed Hannah's arm, his voice low and panicked. "We're leaving. Now." But Hannah didn't budge. "You're not seriously mad about this, are you?" I called after them as they walked out. "This was your idea." She didn't come home that night. For once, I didn't care. Hannah came home the next morning, looking like she'd been through a war. Her makeup was smudged, her hair disheveled, and the confident facade she usually wore had completely crumbled. She dropped her keys on the counter with a loud clatter, her movements sharp and angry. "What the hell was that last night?" she demanded, her voice already raised as she stormed into the living room where I was sitting. I didn't look up from my laptop. "What was what?" "Don't play dumb, Luke," she snapped. "You know exactly what I'm talking about." I closed the laptop and leaned back, finally meeting her glare with a calm expression. "You mean me taking your advice and exploring my options? Isn't that what you wanted?" Her face twisted in anger, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Not like that. You're not supposed to sleep with people we know. Oh, I see, I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. So it's fine for you to screw Ethan, but when I get close to Ashley, suddenly there are rules? Her eyes flashed with frustration. This was supposed to make things better between us, Luke. It wasn't supposed to be about revenge. I laughed, shaking my head. Better? Hannah, you've been sneaking around behind my back for months, lying to my face, and you think this is about fixing things? She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. For a moment, she just stood there, staring at me like she didn't recognize the person sitting in front of her. Then she spun around and stormed upstairs, slamming the bedroom door behind her. That afternoon, Ethan called me. Look, we need to talk, he said, his voice tense. We really don't, I replied, already tempted to hang up. Come on, man. Look, I didn't know it would go this far. I thought it was just casual. Casual? I repeated, the word bitter in my mouth. Ethan, you've been screwing my wife. I don't care how casual you thought it was. He sighed heavily. Ashley wants to call off the wedding. She's furious with me. You've made this so much worse. I laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. I made it worse? That's rich. You and Hannah lit this fire, Ethan. I'm just letting it burn. He started to say something else, but I hung up. The next few days were quiet. Too quiet. Hannah barely spoke to me, though I could feel her anger simmering just beneath the surface. She spent most of her time in the guest room, scrolling through her phone or texting people I didn't care to ask about. On Friday, she came into the living room while I was watching TV, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. You can't seriously want to throw everything away, she said, her voice calmer now, almost pleading. I muted the TV and looked at her, waiting for her to continue. We've been together for 10 years, Luke, she said, taking a hesitant step closer. I know I screwed up, but we can fix this. We can go to therapy, or take a break, or... No, I said firmly, cutting her off. We're not fixing this, Hannah. You wanted freedom, and now you've got it. You don't get to come crawling back just because things didn't go the way you planned. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might argue again. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping as she dropped onto the arm of the couch. Do you even love me anymore? I stared at her, the weight of the question hanging in the air between us. Finally, I said, I don't know, but I do know I don't trust you anymore. And without trust, what's the point? She didn't have an answer. Instead, she stood up, brushing invisible dust off her jeans, and left the room. The next morning, I left the divorce papers on the kitchen counter where I knew she'd see them. I didn't say anything. I just watched as she stared at them, her hands trembling slightly as she picked them up. You're serious about this, she whispered, more to herself than to me. I've never been more serious about anything, I said. She didn't try to argue. Not this time. She just set the papers back down and walked out the door. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet, peaceful. I wasn't sure if she'd sign them, but it didn't matter. I was done waiting for her to make up her mind. This was my decision now, and I wasn't looking back. Hannah didn't come home that night. I wasn't surprised. She'd been unraveling ever since I left the divorce papers out, and I knew she'd reach her breaking point eventually. When she finally walked through the door the next evening, she was drunk. The smell of wine hit me before I even saw her. She stumbled into the kitchen, her hair a mess and her mascara smudged like she'd been crying. Her keys clattered onto the counter as she leaned against it for support. You win, she slurred, pointing a shaky finger at me where I sat at the dining table. I didn't answer, just watched her, waiting to see where this was going. Is this what you wanted, Luke? She demanded, her voice cracking. To see me like this? Broken? Miserable? I set down the book I'd been pretending to read and leaned back in my chair. No, Hannah. What I wanted was a wife I could trust. But you made sure I didn't get that. Her face twisted into something between anger and despair. She let out a bitter laugh, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing the makeup further. You're such a self-righteous asshole, she spat. Like you didn't do the same thing. Did I? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Because last I checked, I didn't lie to your face for months or sneak around with someone else while pretending everything was fine. You're sleeping with Ashley, she shot back, her voice rising. After you dragged me into this mess, I said sharply. Don't act like what I did even comes close to what you've been doing. Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked utterly defeated. I didn't want this, she whispered, barely audible. But you started it, I replied, my tone cold. And now you're pissed that I'm finishing it. She didn't say anything after that. Instead, she grabbed a glass from the cabinet and poured herself another drink, sinking onto the couch without a word. I didn't join her. I went upstairs, closing the bedroom door behind me and leaving her alone with her thoughts. The next morning, she was still there, curled up on the couch with the glass sitting empty on the coffee table. She didn't stir when I walked into the kitchen, and I didn't bother trying to wake her. By the time she finally got up, I was halfway through my coffee. She shuffled into the kitchen, looking worse than I'd ever seen her. Her voice was hoarse when she spoke. We can stop this. Stop what? I asked, not looking up from my laptop. This game, she said, gesturing vaguely around the room. We don't have to end things, Luke. We can try to fix it. I closed my laptop and stood, crossing my arms as I looked at her. No, Hannah. You can stop. I'm done. Her lips trembled, and for a moment, I thought she might cry again. Instead, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there in the silence. Later that day, Ashley called. How's your end holding up? She asked, her tone light, but with an edge of curiosity. Falling apart, I said with a small laugh. Ethan's been calling nonstop, she said. I finally blocked him. Good call, I replied. He doesn't deserve your time. Neither does she, Ashley said pointedly. Have you heard from her today? She's here, I admitted, barely holding it together, but still trying to convince me this is salvageable. Ashley snorted. Typical. You deserve better, Luke. You know that, right? Maybe, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it yet. The conversation shifted after that, moving to lighter topics, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe. Talking to Ashley was easy, uncomplicated in a way that everything with Hannah hadn't been for years. That evening, Hannah finally picked up the divorce papers. She sat at the kitchen table with a pen in hand, staring at the forms for what felt like hours. I stayed in the living room, not wanting to push her. Eventually, she called out to me. If I sign these, that's it? That's it, I said simply, not moving from my seat. She didn't say anything after that. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of the pen scratching against the paper, followed by the shuffle of her chair as she stood. When she walked past me to leave the room, her face was unreadable. The papers were left neatly stacked on the counter, signed and dated. She went upstairs, and I stayed where I was, staring at those papers for a long time. This was the end, but instead of sadness, all I felt was relief. I was finally free. The house was eerily quiet the morning after Hannah signed the divorce papers. Her signature sat there on the stack like the final chapter of a book I'd been forcing myself to finish. I didn't feel triumphant or angry. I didn't even feel sad. Just done. Hannah moved out within the week. She packed in silence, her movements slow and deliberate, as if dragging the process out might change my mind. It didn't. She avoided looking at me the whole time, but I noticed her pause when she took down a photo of us from our honeymoon. For a second, I thought she might say something. Apologize. Beg. But she just placed the frame in a box and moved on. When she finally left, the house felt emptier than I expected. The silence was heavy, like a reminder of how much had been lost, but at the same time, there was a strange sense of peace in it. I wasn't sure what came next, but I knew it wouldn't include her. A few days later, Ashley reached out. Ethan finally stopped trying to contact me, she said when I answered. Guess he got the message. That's a relief, I replied, leaning back in my chair. How are you holding up? Better than I thought I'd be, she admitted. It's weird, though. I spent years planning this life with him, and now it's like all that time just vanished. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. I get it. I keep wondering if I should feel more about this. Like maybe I should be angry, or heartbroken, or something. But all I feel is relief. Relief is a start, she said softly. We kept talking for a while, about everything and nothing. She made me laugh, something I hadn't done in weeks, and for a moment, I forgot why my life had fallen apart in the first place. Over the next few months, we stayed in touch. No big gestures or dramatic declarations, just quiet moments of connection that made the days feel a little easier. We met up a few times, once for coffee, another time for a walk in the park, and each time, it felt less like revenge and more like possibility. One evening, I was sitting on the back porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, when a text from Hannah came through. "I'm sorry," it read. I stared at the screen for a long time, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. I thought about all the things I could say, all the hurt I could throw back at her, but none of it seemed worth it. Finally, I locked my phone and set it aside without replying. Some things were better left in the past. A few weeks later, I ran into Ashley at a small gallery downtown. She was standing in front of a painting, her head tilted as she studied the brushstrokes. She didn't notice me at first, and for a moment, I just watched her, taking in the ease with which she moved, the way she carried herself like someone who'd finally shed a heavy burden. When she turned and saw me, she smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that lit up the room. "Look," she said, stepping closer. "What are you doing here?" "Needed a distraction," I replied. "What about you?" "Same," she said, her eyes flicking back to the painting. "Funny how things like this can feel like a fresh start, isn't it?" I nodded, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like she was right. We didn't talk about Ethan or Hannah that night. Instead, we wandered through the gallery, sharing quiet observations and stories about everything else. It felt simple, uncomplicated. As we walked out into the crisp evening air, she looked over at me, her expression thoughtful. "Think you're ready for that fresh start yet?" she asked. I hesitated, but only for a moment. "Yeah," I said, smiling at her. "I think I am." And for the first time, I actually believed it.